Okay, well, I'm here to make the introduction. Hello, everyone. And as we always say in APRU online events, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Adrian Little, and I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor International at the University of Melbourne in Australia. I'd like to welcome you all to this second meeting of the Asia Pacific Indigenous Studies Seminar. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Narm, which is the Waimarie name for the land on which the city of Melbourne was founded. I'm introducing the seminar today from the unceded territory of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. In the spirit of this seminar series and the APRU Indigenous Knowledges Network, I would also like to emphasize the foundational role that Indigenous knowledge has to play in the Academy. I also extend the acknowledgement to the custodians of the land and sea, wherever you're joining us from, and in particular, our Maori colleagues here today in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today with our colleagues from Ngāpai o te Māramatanga. To lead the discussion and chair the Q&A, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Linda Waimarie Nikora. Linda, over to you.
Tēnā koe, Adrian. Let me simply begin by offering to APRU our appreciation for the opportunity to be here today, and to simply say that APRU is a fantastic web of connectedness across and around the Pacific. Given that we're from Aotearoa, right down the bottom of the Pacific, it's wonderful to be part of this much larger network. I just simply want to acknowledge that wherever we are as people, whatever places we occupy, wherever we are, that we all rest on Papatūānuku, we all rest on the planet, and from time to time, it's good to simply pause and appreciate the life-giving energies of Papatūānuku in terms of nurturing our peoples, our environments, and indeed our futures. So tēnā koutou, it's wonderful to be sitting amongst you. So in today's session, what we had proposed to do was to tell the audience a little bit about Ngāpai o te Māramatanga, which is Aotearoa, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence. And to do that, we were going to perhaps look over a few case studies with presentations from my colleagues. Inevitably, in global events, when people are coming together across time zones, someone somewhere gets a little bit confused about what time exactly it is in the world. And in fact, I initially thought that this symposium was going to happen tomorrow in terms of datelines and the like. So as a consequence of us getting a little bit confused, there are two of our speakers who are unable to join us today. We had actually prepped to be ready at 7 o'clock tonight, not 2 o'clock this afternoon. But hoi anō, we are a very experienced team and we're able to cover. So to begin, what I will do is I'll tell and talk a little bit about Ngāpai o te Māramatanga, and then my colleagues, my co-director, Pau Matarua, Professor Tahu Kukutai, who's joined us today, will speak to her topic, which is data sovereignty. And secondly, one of our research leaders, Dr. Mohi Rua, will talk to his particular topic, which is precarity. and we'll elaborate. I'll let him elaborate on that word as we move forward. We'll speak for around about 15 minutes each, and I think at the end of each session we'll take a few questions, and then at the end of all our presentations we're more than happy to continue our conversation dependent upon time. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and in the narrative that I present to you, you'll learn a little bit more about myself, and my colleagues as we move through the presentations will also take the opportunity to introduce and tell you a little bit more about themselves. So, tēnā koutou. So I'm going to screen share, and we'll just, so hopefully you can see that that screen. Whilst, Andrew, if you just nod. Thank you, that's brilliant. So I'm Linda Waimarie and Nikora. I'm from Te Aitanga Hauti Ngai Tūhoe, me wera atu iwi o te Tairāwhiti. I am from my own tribal groups of Tūhoe and Te Aitanga Hauti. I'm presently co-director Paumatarua of Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga, and I have been so since 2017. So I've been about 5 years in the role, and I'm thrilled to sit alongside Tahuku Tahu, who's here today, co-director, and Mohi, who's also here today. And I'll introduce some of our other team as we move through. So everything in terms of the Indigenous world, Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous researchers has to start with context. So I'm going to do a real rapid race through history, just to give you an idea of how Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga came into existence. And this is the long history, not the short history. So I want to start first with going back to Abel Tasman in 1642. The first Western world explorer into our oceans here in the South Pacific, and then later Captain James Cook. So those were the first voyages of encounter, and they were, interestingly, in terms of the James Cook expeditions, were funded as science and knowledge expeditions. They are down here to learn more about science, I guess. So after the arrival of those first voyages, we had lots and lots of traders coming through the area, and then those were followed by the first missionaries. And with the first missionaries was the opportunity to increase our capacity in terms of Māori literacy. One of the important points about this history to understand is that we were not passive in the process of colonization. We were very, very active, and we were engaged in such a way to realize our own aspirations and interests. So, for example, when the missionaries came, it was really, really good to have a missionary in your community, because we could leverage the missionaries in terms of their language skills in order to trade and communicate what our views were to the broader world at large. So if we look back over time in history, there was lots and lots of encounters between Māori about who had a missionary and who didn't. The same treatment was, the same approach was used in terms of literacy. We very, very quickly recognized the value of literacy, the efficiency that it provided in terms of communication, and also the worlds that it opened to Māori in terms of being able to read primarily the Bible, and from a Māori perspective, reading the Bible was really, really interesting because it opened a view onto other people's cosmological narratives, life ways, cultures, and poetry, for example. So, and oratory. And Māori were very, very adept at those particular things. And so it was the Bible Christianity was a interesting curiosity to Māori. So we picked up on literacy very, very quickly. In fact, there were many, many more Māori who were literate than actually Pākehā or new arrivals coming into the country. Many new arrivals were not literate, but Māori were. We picked up that very, very early. So moving into the 1890s, we had the first Māori scholars who had graduated from, they'd been to university and graduated. That's not to say we didn't have our own forms of celebrating expertise and excellence. Those things continued to exist within the Māori world. But given that we're concerned with the academy, I'm just focusing on the first Māori scholars. So there were 4 giants in that particular space for us. It's not a conclusive list. There are other people who are in that space as well. But they had a vision and an aspiration for Māori, and that had to do with ensuring that when subsequent generations entered into the academy, that we could actually see ourselves within those contexts. So they challenged the institutions to establish Māori studies within the academy, including the teaching of Māori language. At the time when they were having or putting those proposals forward, there was a pushback from scholars within the academy that basically said, well, Māori studies is not even a subject, it's actually not even a knowledge. And that there's no real canon of information that people could actually use to teach the subject. What they then did was, between these 4 people, Apiranga Maui Rangihiro James Carroll, apologies for Apiranga's name, it's spelt wrong. What they did was separated amongst them the task of creating a canon of information that could be used for the study of the Māori world. So Apiranga Ngata went off and put together what we now know as Ngā Mōtetea, which is the chant records of the Māori world. And as an oral people, that's really, really important because through those chant records there's so much information being passed. Maui Pōmare put together our origin narratives. Sir Rangihiro put together various volumes on material culture, Māori material culture, and James Carroll focused on Māori land tenure. So we had those people through as the first graduates, and there was a constant trickle over time from the 1900s. And Māori really didn't start coming into the academy in any significant numbers until around about 1970s, when we're experiencing what's often described as the most rapid process of urbanization in the world. So that's around about the 1970s. So put this into context, the first co-director of Ngā Pae o te Māramatanga, Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, graduated with her PhD in '96. I graduated in 2007. Ngā Pao Te Māramatanga was established in 2012. And indeed, in the early 2010s, we celebrated the existence of 500 Māori PhDs. And we continue in that mission to grow those numbers. I want to just focus on an exchange that occurred between Apiranga Ngata and Sir Maui Pōmare. And they wrote lots and lots of letters to each other commenting on everything. And Maui Pōmare was based at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. He was the director there. And he was writing back to Apiranga Ngata about the challenges of accommodating Māori as an Indigenous people and a subject matter within the academy. And this is what he said, and I'm going to linger on this for a little while because I think that it points to so much of what we are doing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, around Māori-led research, around taking charge of research and control of research for and about us, and some of our aspirations moving forward. So what he was saying, remember this was written in 1939. So if you look back to languaging in 1939, it's extremely racist, and you know, sort of the languaging they used was very apolitical. So Te Rangi Hiro said, use the race itself, use us as a people to record its own culture and with its own local interpretations. So if we, so here he's actually tapping into the whole emic view of the world, that insiders to communities bring a particular perspective that's different to outsiders. And we need to take control of that particular narrative. Māori could become a monument of real research work that would be second to none in the world as regards a native race. And I think that given Te Rangi Hiro's writing and scholarly achievements in terms of material culture, Māori material culture, he's written in volumes in terms of the Māori world. And if we look at where we're at now in terms of the canon, it's grown exponentially in terms of Māori-led research, Māori writing, and Māori scholarship. All these other native cultures are being worked out by Pākehā, so non-Māori, with all the drawbacks that they have as regards to language and viewpoint. So again, he's tapping into the issue of emic versus etic, the need to actually understand ourselves within our own worldview and within the context of our own languages as a really, really important thing for us to be doing. And lastly, he says, e hoa mutu te wā kia te pēhi mā. Ko riro mā tāua, mā te Māori taua kōrero. So the time for Best, and Best was might be described as a gentleman ethnographer. What he was basically saying was the time for anthropologists and ethnographers from other worlds is over. As Māori, we should take the responsibility on ourselves to lead this work and to actually create a future that we want to create moving forward. So I just want to leap forward now to Ngā Pao Te Māramatanga. That's the history. And I want to just highlight what our mission is, which is to create the foundations for flourishing Māori futures. if we look back over time to those early leaders, all the way through different iterations of our core, our Centre of Research and Excellence, it has always been about creating a future that is promising, where future generations can harness the opportunities that are available to them, and to actually be the own navigators of their lives. So for ngā pā te Māramatanga, our mission is to create strong foundations for future generations to stand in such a way that they maintain their own wellness for themselves, their families, as well as the planet. So I'm going to quickly go through, but before that, I will acknowledge some important, very, very important people who have come before me. So the core was established by Michael Walker, Professor Michael Walker, and Linda Tuhiwai-Smith. So many of you may know her work and a book called Decolonizing Methodologies. And so she's a real giant for us in terms of the academy. And, you know, I continue to stand in awe of her leadership. So they were the founding co-directors. And later on, we had Professor Tracy McIntosh, also based at the University of Auckland, followed by Charles Royal, Jacinta Ruru, and myself, and Tahu Kukutai. And so I see myself, and no doubt Tahu probably would as well, so I'll speak on behalf of us. I see myself as part of a continuity and part of a whole host of people who are making a contribution to the Academy. We'll leave that slide for the moment. Okay, so moving now to our strategic directions and some of our strategies which might interest others at other institutions in terms of how we configure ourselves to do what we do. We're really concerned to not be captured by the usual bricks and mortars of institutions and how institutions kind of think about things. So here, in looking at this particular picture, you probably can't see a faculty of engineering or a faculty of medicine or a faculty of Māori studies for that matter. And that is because it's all in there, but configured in such a way that speaks into our Māori world. The four livings that you see are not direct translations of what's above, but they are handy doorways into how we organize ourselves. So basically, in terms of creating the foundations, well, what are we going to concentrate on? Well, we're going to concentrate on maintaining our uniqueness, our distinctiveness as Māori. We're going to concentrate on living well, living lightly in terms of our impact on the planet, and also with an eye to sustainability, climate change issues, and the like. We're going to be smart about it because we've got a world of technology out there, and just because we're interested in what is often referred to as mātauranga Māori or Māori cultural knowledge, if you like, traditional knowledge, it doesn't mean to say that we're not interested in data science, technologies, engineering, and the like. And then we've got a few other strategies sitting in behind that help to supercharge what we do. 4 questions interrogate what we do. And all that we do has to feed back to these 4 questions in terms of us measuring, I suppose, whether or not we're on track. and in scope relative to what we do. So, the first is looking at Te Ao Māori. We want to maintain our distinctiveness, and so we want to ensure that our own Mātauranga Māori is continues to be generated, regenerated, and renewed moving forward. Whanau Wellbeing is hugely important. The critical unit in terms of survival is the whānau unit. And without whānau, then that becomes a real challenge in terms of just meeting survival needs. And Mohi's going to touch on that a little bit more as we move through. Pātai Māori. Māori speaks to the critical essence that enables life. So it is critically about sustainability. If you don't look after that particular essence, then all things start to diminish. And then lastly, looking to transformative changes. Change is such a funny thing. You think that you've achieved something and it's a step forward, and then suddenly something happens and we're 10 steps backwards. But that's just simply the nature of progress. 10 steps, one step forward, 10 steps back. At least we're still making progress along the way. So running very quickly through these slides, these are some of our leaders, excellence leaders, and they help to configure our network of researchers and our students across pretty much all the institutions across Aotearoa, New Zealand, in terms of Māori-led conceived research. This is Jenny, and basically one of the highlights there is that her job is to support the researchers in terms of their capability and capacity around living uniquely, pai ahure. An activity that might fall in there is, for example, we have a ruanuku. So the ruanuku are our wise ones. And we've got one ruanuku, Te Awa Kōtuka, out there at the moment, making a fantastic television documentary on contemporary Māori art. Moving to Pai Ora, Professor Paparangi Reid, well known in medicine, and I think maybe Adrian, a colleague of yours, absolutely focused on COVID, equity, racism, structural racism, inequity in the health sector. So we've got teams there who are making responses, providing advice to government and the like. Pai Tawhiti, Associate Professor Ocean Mercier, who's a trained physicist, but has taken what she's learned in physics and evolved that in the Māori studies space. So they're in that particular team working around sustainable livelihoods, creating healthy environmental relationships. So a lot of our work in the past was actually focused on the environment as opposed to environmental relationships, because that's really going to make the difference in terms of moving forward in healthy environments. Associate Professor Te Taka Keegan has been a computer scientist in the data science space for all of his career. And so we're really, he's a rare event, and so we're really glad that he's on board. Pātai Te Ao Māori. Here we look to strategic relationships and partnerships with other major entities who are really engaged with the revitalization and blossoming of Te Ao Māori. But Karen is a really important advisor to our network. We've got Mohirua on the screen, and he'll talk a little bit about some of the work he's doing in the Whanau Wellbeing space. Pātai Māori, we have a very, very large team around climate change issues. There's a lot of advice being given out to city councils and regional councils and homeowners, etc., about what they should be doing to mitigate the effects of climate change. But none of that advice is well considered when it comes to Māori communities. And so this team put together a report that basically said, hey, here are all the things that you should be considering if you are Māori, if you are Māori landowner, relative to our communities at large. So a really helpful report, which ended up in the hands of the president, I think, of COP26. So just a few more slides to go before I conclude. Pātai Puāwai, this is a really, really important area for us. If our research is not being felt on the ground by our people, if it's not actually making a difference for our people, then we're not doing something right. And so we always are coming back to how can we get value out of the research that our researchers are doing, how can we add value, and how can we land it in the right place in front of the right people who are making the decisions that are really going to make a difference for the Māori world moving forward. So that's Pātai Puāwai. A couple of strategies. Professional excellence is a real important area for us. You would have noticed 500 PhDs in an earlier slide. A lot of those PhDs have actually gone into the research sector and working as researchers, or alternatively into the academy as scholars. And so Ngāpuhi Te Māramatanga does not stop its support of our people just because they now have a PhD. Our support has to continue to be alongside all our researchers, all our academics, irrespective of what stage in career they are. So for example, we've got many academics who are moving now to the space of being professors or leaders of large research entities for the first time, and they haven't necessarily been well mentored. And so one of the important things that Ngāpuhi does is actually walk alongside our researchers wherever they are. And we continue our site to our support to some really, really fabulous and promising students who are actually coming through our universities. Indigenous scholarship, as I said before, has just simply exploded in the last 20, 30 years. And here are some of the publications that we have. And if you want to follow up on those, that's the web link there. And I'll ask Anya to make this PPT available to you after the seminar. Partnerships, connectedness, strategic relationships are really, really important. In the Māori world, whakapapa is really, really important. Relationality is hugely important because we can get things achieved that oftentimes you cannot do by yourself. So we've got 21 absolutely critical strategic partners that we work with all the way through the country. And we had them online yesterday, and they're a really excitable bunch. They're really gung-ho, so it's wonderful to have him on board. A good read, if you want a good read, and to delve into some of the specifics that our scholars are doing and the challenges that they're having relative to their discipline areas. So, for example, I mentioned Ocean Mercia earlier on, the physicist. She's got a chapter in there where she tells her story about her journey through the academy, some of the encounters that she had, some of the research she really, really enjoyed doing, and what her aspirations are in terms of her own career. And I think we've got around about 20 scholars who tell those stories. So it's a good read. It's been sold out 3 times. So I hope there's still copies available. I hope your library's got one, Adrian. Yeah. Lastly, 15th of November, our International Indigenous Research Conference is online. Again, it frustrates me because, hey, you know, Aotearoa citizens are major passport holders, major travelers, and we haven't been able to get out of the country to see people. But we're also in the middle of continue to be in the middle of a pandemic. We're experiencing secondary infections at the moment, and this pandemic is not done until it's done, and it's not done with us just yet. So we are still online for conference, but it makes it easier for you to come. So it's an invitation to you to come join with us and share with us, and it would be just absolutely brilliant if we be able to see each other there. I probably have spoken for far too long. And I'm not going to take questions because I do want to allow the time for my colleagues, and I know that there will be opportunity at the end to have a further conversation. So I'm going to turn now to Muhi to kick into some of the interesting work that he's been doing as a case study, a specific case study of some of the work that the flavour of the work that Ngāpai does. So tēnā koe Muhi.
Kia ora, Linda, and kia ora everybody. And yeah, I'd like to reiterate the point that this is an insight into, or a case study that reflects some of the work done within Ngāpai, and we know that the work at Ngāpai is broad and interconnected, is relational, goes across disciplines, and draws on a multitude of methodological approaches and theories. So by no means does what I present here reflect all that work, but simply a slice of research that we do in Ngāpai. So I'm just going to share quickly, make sure I get the right, sorry, I don't think I did, well, hang on, let me look at something. Okay. I haven't shared anything, have I? No, okay, let me try that again. There it is. Okay, cool. Just can you give me a sec? I'm just going to try and find my notes. They should be popping up, but there it is. Okie doke. Okay, kia ora everybody. My name is Mohirua. I'm from Waikato University, and my disciplinary background is in psychology, particularly covered Māori psychology, or Māori perspective on psychology, Indigenous psychology, and I was trained as a community psychologist. So a lot of my research draws upon those disciplinary approaches. In today's presentation, we'll engage a Ngāpai funded project where we take a Māori perspective on life for Māori who live in poverty, and we draw on the notion of precariat, which I will get into in a second. So the presentation today will reflect upon the experiences of whānau, families, Māori families in poverty, to illustrate an alternative framing of the challenges faced by precarious Māori whānau. Often when we're dealing with impoverished peoples, the challenge is to consider the structural and societal dimensions of poverty when we're confronted with the more dominant individualistic perspectives of poverty, or at least the narrative that surrounds poverty, particularly for our whānau who are narrated as either lazy or dull bludgers or even the undeserving poor. So this presentation will provide a small insight, and certainly not the whole story, into the lives of the Māori precariat. I'm just going to start my timer to make sure that I stay on time. Won't be a sec. Okay. And I'm happy to take questions during this presentation as well. Linda will monitor them. So if you've got something, if you're jumping up and down, please go ahead and Linda will jump in and let me know. Just a quick overview. So I'll introduce the small project. I'll contextualize the notion of precarity and some of the main responses to precarity in Aotearoa. And then I'll look primarily at whānau accounts of their precariat lives and the way they negotiate their lives in poverty. And I'll conclude with a couple of key points about how whānau can move from precarity to flourishing. So our research, and I should say that I'm one member of a bunch of people in this project, and I haven't named them in the beginning of this presentation, but there's a team of us. So our research explores the efforts of socio-economically marginalised Māori whānau. And some of the questions we explore include what does socio-economic marginalisation look like in the everyday lives of our precariat whānau? And how do whānau cope and push back against the boundaries of their precarious lives? And in this presentation, or at least in our research, we draw upon the work by Guy Standing and the notion of the precariat, where Guy identifies three key dimensions that the precariat exists in. And one of them is a class of people who live lives of insecure employment. So in and out of jobs, temporary stuff, it's really unstable. Insecure income, where money is the inadequate amounts of money coming through the household, or income insecurity is really flexible, so people don't know how much they're getting from day to day or week to week. And the precariat also include people who have fewer political and economic rights. And so particularly those who live on the welfare, who have reduced rights as a citizen. So this is the notion we're drawing on. If you happen to hear people screaming in the back, that's my four kids who have returned from school, who are full of beans at the moment. So I'll make sure we'll try and keep them down. The Māori precariat operate within a larger context, and the poverty experienced by our people is not reducible to individual deficiencies, which is often the narrative surrounding those in poverty. New Zealand has had a phenomenal housing boom over the last 20 years, which has seen a massive increase, around over 230% increase in house prices, one of the most rapid increases in the OECD. I mean, this has meant significant passive wealth gains for property owners and rental housing investors, mostly non-Māori. And these people tend to have the most political power and influence. So there's a significant pressure to sustain the status quo for this particular group. So we have a housing crisis in terms of affordability, a significant shortage of houses available for rent, coupled with high rental costs and general cost of living, which has led to our current cost of living crises. We also have reduced security and employment with flexible jobs that ensure insecure incomes. We've got a welfare system that's punitive and punishes beneficiaries through cutting benefits and reducing entitlements, which is often the difference between having food on the table or power in the home. So such experiences and representations have added to almost this entrenched inertia in terms of closing the gaps between Māori and non-Māori, which has led to widespread poverty denial, really, by many of our affluent New Zealanders. And so the human and economic costs of this are high. Māori are overrepresented in the groups who aren't flourishing in our corner of the world. And all of these factors are raised in the slide. And all of these factors are interconnected and have intensified the hardships for people in precarious, insecure life worlds at an individual level. Our current coalition government, which was elected to power in 2017, has recognised the extent of the crises the nation faces, but mostly their solutions are largely ameliorative and work in the current neoliberal market system. And that market system is often the root cause of issues such as housing speculation and poverty generally. Many government responses, as I said, are sort of a piecemeal, and they don't resolve the property traps and the systems and structures that position our whānau in poverty in the first place. Our economic growth models, which underpin government policies, are similar to a pyramid scheme where riches and resources stay with the top and there's no trickle-down effect. There's also this unsophisticated and ignorant notion that the way out of poverty is through jobs. But what we know is that most people in poverty are actually in employment. So we've got to challenge that narrative as well. So what we need are more cooperative, collaborative, and socially transforming initiatives that focuses on the structural and systemic changes for our people, rather than the individual nudging and intervening of the state in individual lives who see individuals as the problem and the deficit. So although this presentation isn't focused on the systemic changes, that's another story, it's important to contextualize the individual life worlds of our whānau. But this presentation is looking at promoting and humanizing the individual experiences of precarity. They're often disregarded within the discourse, and to promote the human effect of poverty in everyday life and the survival strategies our whānau employ. So that's what I'll get into now. To understand the precarious lives of our whānau, we worked with a couple of agencies who engage our whānau to get insights into their plight. And the objective, as I sort of just mentioned, was to humanize the everyday experience and to illustrate an alternate framing of the challenges faced by precarious Māori whānau beyond the individual discourse, which sees them as deficient and lazy and undeserving. And so what I'm going to go through are some quotes from some of our participants reflecting upon their lives. And the quote here is from one participant who has been in her state house for over 20 years. And this particular quote reflects the lack of engagement of our social housing sector, or Housing New Zealand, as it used to be called, into the maintenance of homes for our whānau in poverty. So it's meant the houses have fallen into disrepair, as the agency of the time was required to return a profit to central government. Currently, the coalition government has a greater commitment to state housing, but it's faced with a massive maintenance backlog and an unprecedented demand from homeless families. And if we think about, and so this quote here from a whānau, I hate Housing New Zealand. Been in this house for 26 odd years, and they've done very little to do to fix up their home. Hot water cylinder, won't even heat anymore. There's some problems with the electricals and a whole range of issues that this whānau experiences as this person reflects the needs of a particular whānau. This person here, Te Rina, her frustrations come out in this quote, which can be interpreted as antisocial if expressed in government agency offices. And Te Rina's situation is common amongst families on low incomes. There's still a belief that paid work is as I mentioned before, paid work is the primary solution to poverty. However, having a paid job is no guaranteed pathway out of poverty. And it's harder to budget or plan for the future. And there's a whole range of issues here that Te Rina speaks to in terms of getting MPs involved in some of the issues that she's had to deal with. And what we have here in terms of insecure food and hunger has resulted in a range of issues so this conversation between Te Rina and the interviewer highlights the extent of food insecurity for New Zealanders generally. While child hunger, which has had a massive coverage over the last sort of 15 odd years, that hunger of children also occurs within whānau, which doesn't get as much attention. And the hunger of the parents is often hidden from view. So the current response of relying on charities, and even in New Zealand, we had gangs even providing food to the impoverished whānau. Is that sort of approach, charities and gangs, is ad hoc and problematic. More recently, we've had food in schools for low decile schools in particular, which addresses the immediate needs, but it fails to resolve hunger generally, particularly for whānau, and even kids in the weekends and school holidays, etc., etc. Here, in speaking with this particular participant, to feed themselves, they'll basically drink a cup of tea for a couple of days until they can get their next welfare payment. Māori whānau aren't passive in relation to the hardships they face as well. They're survivors, they're the navigators, and there's no lack of agency in their response to precarity. So in this instance, Keegan has a strategy so his kids can have what he didn't have. Keegan himself is a product of the state. He went through 11 foster homes in 10 years as a child, and this separation continues today as a parent. So Keegan's decided to live in a night shelter so his partner can get access to state benefits that ensures his kids have a relatively stable place to live in. But this isn't a stable or sustainable strategy and comes at a significant cost to his own health and well-being. So the story of our participants reflect the situation of too many of our whānau who feel like life is like similar to running through sinking sand. The more you struggle, the more you sink. So most policies and initiatives only offer temporary relief, but do not change the fact that these whānau are never lifted out of that trap or that quicksand. One of the activities we did with our whānau included what we call service maps, so to show what services that our whānau use over a 2-week period. And here we have a map for one particular participant who is involved in 19 organisations over a 2-week period. And so in this particular map, we say that being poor is a full-time job. You'll see that this person here distinguishes these organisations into those they have to go to, those they need to go to, and those they choose to go to. Those they have to go to, such as welfare officers, often classified as more punitive and to be avoided because of the stress that participants feel they're under when they're engaging in the service. Then there are those they need to go to. And those they need to go to, like budgeting officers, medical services, are identified as treating whānau with a bit more dignity. Then there are those organisations that whānau choose to go to and are utilised because they're more supportive, they're holistic in nature, and they don't treat whānau as defective and have this genuine interest in them as a person. And so it's like, so life for these whānau is like an obstacle course. And it means surviving and dealing with bureaucratic demands, pushing paper around, etc. They were even having to research their own entitlements rather than turning up to an organisation being told the entitlements. And for many of them, it's also about what Miriam talks about as getting into character. So engaging these services, people like Miriam talk about pretending to be someone that they're not, in order to be acceptable to government staff and to get access to their services. So they get into character that's visually appropriate, apparent at that appearance level, and act and behave in ways that are expected by the state. And so this reflects the way their whānau navigate the landscape of services by learning how to play the game and how to behave in a manner that allows them to access their rightful entitlements without penalties or sanctions. And so for beneficiaries, a lot of this is about avoiding penalties, avoiding sanctions if they fail to effectively navigate our contemporary welfare system.
Probably up to final statements.
Oh, yep, okay. I can get to that. I was just in our concluding comments. So in summary, our whānau live incredible lives, extraordinary lives that are made more difficult by a system that's incredibly complex. It's fragmented, it's not connected, and often treats our whānau as inhumanely. Our whānau experience life worlds of insecurity in terms of food, income, housing, and employment. And homelessness is that hard edge of precarity, of poverty, in many of our whānau experiences. So we need to respond in ways that address this. Our whānau, like these everyday experiences. There are a range of things we can do. Some of them are like resource redistribution, equitable labour laws, access to care and sustainable livelihoods. We need to rein in a whole bunch of the property speculation sector, tax fraud, white collar tax fraud, industries such as gambling, loan sharks, etc. We also need, a PIF to overhaul our welfare system and avoid the penal welfare that currently exists. And this is happening right now. So all these policies to address precarious whānau lives must be developed with whānau and not just on whānau. And with that, I'll leave it there.
And tēnā koe muhi. Thank you for being so agreeable and in terms of concluding. It's wonderful. And I just want to pick up on Adrian's comment in the track about in the chat about allies, and just continuing to look at your final slide. Quite clearly, we cannot do this all by ourselves in terms of changing our whole system. And so allies, relationships, strategic partnerships become critically important for the aspirations that we want to achieve. So on that note, I'm going to turn now to Tahu and give the time to her. So tēnā koe Tahu. You might want to stop sharing your screen, Mohi.
Yep, I'm trying. Things have gone all haywire on my screen, so let me figure this out. Sorry.
It's okay. Do we want?
Oh, here we go. No, I found it. There you go.
Oh, so I'll talk briefly then, and then we can move to like a Q&A session if we want to, and allow some sufficient time to that. I'm sure people have got some questions. That was a really powerful
absolutely
presentation.
And to invite people to actually put questions into the chat. I can actually see quite a number of our research leadership team are online, and I'd invite our research leadership team to answer those questions as we go. So feel free to use the chat as we go. So kia ora tahu.
Sounds like a great strategy. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Māhanga, Ngāti Tino Haku me te o Kauri, ko tahu kukutai tōku ingoa, ko au tētahi o ngā kaumatarua o ngā pai o te Māramatanga, kei te whare wānanga o Waikatoa haue mahi ana. So greetings everyone on what is a Friday afternoon here. My name is Tahu Kukutai. I sit alongside Waimarie as one of the co-directors of Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga. I'm relatively new to the job, less than 1 year, and we're in our 4th iteration now. I think we saw in Linda's presentation, we have a 20-year anniversary smiling sun because we're so happy that we're still here. It's been a struggle, 20 years, you can't take that for granted. And absolutely standing on the shoulders of giants. We've had some incredible leaders who have got us to this stage. And just a total support Waimarie's comment around sort of continuity and succession planning and support and the nurturing of the network. I myself remember very clearly in 2010 when I got my PhD and I returned from overseas back here to Aotearoa. Linda Smith called me up the day before a major event for Māori doctoral students at my own marae. I went there and got a little trophy, and it was just a beautiful event with other Māori doctoral students. And it's amazing that, 12 years later, I get the opportunity to go from being a doctoral student in the network to becoming a co-director. So, Linda speaks the truth when she says that something that's different about our Centre of Research Excellence is we don't just, support students and then say, see you later. We hold our people close, and that's actually fundamental to, succession planning and having a long-term impact on the sector and for our communities as well. So I just wanted to say that up front. Now, I know we've got a little bit of time. I'm going to punch down my presentation, but I just want to let me see if I can successfully share screen first. Mohi, you've made me a bit nervous with the troubles you had. Let's give this a go. Okay. Aha, well, that's looking good to me. Is that looking good to everyone else? A thumbs up, Jackie. Great, thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Adrian, for organising this and having us along. So I'm just going to add quite briefly today to the Ngā Pai panel by talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is an area that I've been involved in research and advocacy and policy advice for about a decade. And for Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga is the only Indigenous Centre of Research Excellence. This is a critical support for the work that we do now and also heading into the future. Waimarie talked about our 4 pai, and we have one of our pai is Pai Auaha, which is living smartly for wise and ethical technological transformations. It's led by our foremost Māori data scientist, te taka Keegan, who I believe is in the audience. So not only do we have a major research platform focused on this area, we also do a lot of sort of advocacy, which is really around trying to get system change so that the work that we do as a network is actually underpinned by ethical and wise data practices, not only within our own network, because that's our bread and butter, we already do that, but actually in the major institutions that hold a lot of our information. So as many of you will know, universities hold significant collections of Indigenous research data, including data about generated by Indigenous knowledge systems, what we call mātauranga here in Aotearoa. It's often really difficult, if not impossible, to know where the data lies, how to access it, and how to return benefit to the communities from whom the data comes. So, despite holding masses of Indigenous data, universities here in Aotearoa have been pretty slow, too slow, I think, to identify and respond to the opportunities of Māori data sovereignty and Māori data governance. And it's a little ironic, given that there's now a very significant number of Māori data sovereignty researchers working within universities, not only conducting research on this area, but also heavily involved in national and international initiatives and activities. So I just want to give a brief overview of Indigenous data sovereignty from some of you who may be unfamiliar with it. I'm not assuming you have any prior knowledge, and just also ask more specifically, what does this actually mean for the university sector, given that we have a bit of a captive audience here today? I just want to really acknowledge first my colleague and collaborator, Assistant Professor Stephanie Carroll, who's based at the Native Nations Institute in the University of Arizona. I've been working very closely with her for many years now, and we actually spoke on this topic at a joint event organised by the National Science Foundation and Education New Zealand. So it wouldn't feel right if I just charged into this without acknowledging our relationship as well first. So just a bit of a 101, and I've got a major building site beside me, like Mohi's got his children, I've got a building site, so hopefully it's not coming through, it's quite loud for me. Look, just a 101 on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous data, which is at the heart of Indigenous data sovereignty. First of all, sovereignty matters. Second of all, data are our relations. Third, data are critical to the exercising of tribal data sovereignty. and ensuring healthy, vibrant, flourishing communities. This is a really important point. Sometimes people get so caught up in the data, they think it's data for data's sake. It's not. As far as Ngā Pai o Te Māramatanga is concerned, it's really data for flourishing Māori futures. As far as the Māori Data Sovereignty Network is concerned, it's data for collective Māori wellbeing. The framing for the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network is very much focused on data for nation building. So it's not data for data's sake, and it really flies in the face of data colonialism and data capitalism, this idea of Indigenous data sovereignty, which is really about driving forward the collective benefit of our Indigenous communities. Just to return to the slide, Indigenous data sovereignty includes both kind of this dual relationship, data for governance, for Indigenous governance, but also the governance over data that sits, for the most part, in other data systems that are not controlled by Indigenous communities. Mohi talked very powerfully about the deficit narrative that is comported about Indigenous whānau, Māori whānau, particularly the Māori precariat and Māori communities. And Maggie Walter, who's one of my Indigenous colleagues from Australia, has talked very powerfully about the 5 Ds of Indigenous data narratives, and that is that, you know, disadvantage, dysfunctional, deficit, everything negative, and it's often comported on statistical data that's generated through government data systems. So Indigenous data sovereignty is really about disrupting these very negative and very harmful and impactful narratives that are built on data often held by others that are not Indigenous peoples. And also not forgetting that actually Indigenous data sovereignty is not just about battening down the hatches or putting Indigenous data back into Indigenous communities. It's actually a mechanism for innovation and design, and all the stuff that Te Taka has also been involved with in the work that he's done as a data scientist. So it can also be about innovation and doing things differently. Often people get very hung up on quite narrow ideas of what Indigenous data is and think that it's only traditional knowledge, that it's only sort of language resources, or that it's only you know, customary data about customary practices. And that is a very important part of Indigenous data, but it's only a subset of a much broader conceptualization of what Indigenous data includes. So the definition used by a lot of networks is that data is about Indigenous resources and environments, so land information, geological information, titles, water information. It's about us as Indigenous individuals. So this is administrative data, the sort of stuff that Mohi was talking about in his presentation, you know, the contact with different social services. It's legal, health and social data. It's commercially held data, it's service use data, it's our own data. And it's also data about us as collectives and as nations. That's traditional and cultural information, data in the archives, histories, literature, ancestral knowledge, the sort of information that Waimarie was talking about in her opening presentation. This is all Indigenous data. So Indigenous data sovereignty varies a lot from mainstream concepts of data sovereignty, which is really about jurisdiction and data localization. Indigenous data sovereignty really holds these fundamental principles that it derives from our inherent rights to govern peoples, lands and resources, that the genesis is in our traditions, our roles and our responsibilities for the use of community-held information. So really moving away from this very sort of Anglo-Western concept of personal data, personal rights, personal privacy, and this is really the whole legal framework upon which sort of data privacy and protection and use has been built. Indigenous data sovereignty is a very different conceptualization, but it's positioned within a human rights framework and court cases, treaties and recognition, and that the knowledge belongs to the collective, not an individual, certainly not an individual researcher, and absolutely not an individual university, and that it's fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Okay, I have to quite skip through a few slides, I think, because I probably want to finish on 1:15. Is that right, Waimarie? So I mentioned before that there's this sort of dual aspect of Indigenous data sovereignty, and one of that is sort of governance of data. So that's having robust governance mechanisms over the data that's held often outside of Indigenous communities, and then having data for governance. So closing the loop and actually generating data that's going to help communities, tribes, Indigenous organisations govern their own affairs and sort of drive forward their own self-determining aspirations. So there's a lot of activity in this area. There's too much, actually. That could be a whole presentation. So I'm just simply noting here that there's domestic Indigenous data sovereignty networks, all established by academics. Here in Aotearoa in 2015, there's 2 in Australia, one at the University of Melbourne and one at the University of Tasmania, maybe Walter, who's gone on to become a Truth Commissioner, but I believe it's still at the University of Tasmania. The Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and the Canada, they've got the First Nations Information Governance Centre, which has been around for about 2 decades, and we're sort of the pioneers in Indigenous data sovereignty. There's also a global network called GIDA, which is sort of a network of networks that works very much an advocacy at the international global level, and also doing some work with the United Nations. And through GIDA have developed these care principles that some of you may know, the care principles for Indigenous data governance around collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethics. And you can download them as sort of standalone products from the GIDA website, gida.org, very easy to find. And there's also 2 open access books on Indigenous data sovereignty. The first one through ANU ePress, which can be available and downloaded for free. The second one, much more recent, which is on Indigenous data sovereignty and policy, and that's through Rutledge and the Taylor and Francis website. So you can find those resources there, and they basically set out in much more depth Indigenous data sovereignty and all the case studies that you might be interested in. There's increasing global recognition of Indigenous data sovereignty by the UN, by the Research Data Alliance, which is a global network of people, academics and practitioners working in the data space, and also the IEEE, there's some Indigenous dimensions going on there, Indigenous data sovereignty, and the UNESCO recommendations on open science, which I think most universities will now be across. Here in Aotearoa, there's a number of initiatives that are underway. Probably just two that I would mention is there's an all of government co-designed Māori data governance model that's being led out in tandem by the government, the Stats New Zealand, which is the chief functional lead for statistics across the whole government sector. And then on the other hand, the Māori partner is the National Tribal Leaders Forum. So that's an initiative that's currently underway, and it's involving a number of Māori academics, including Ngā Pai researchers who are instrumental in building that model. And the second one that I would name is that the Australia-New Zealand Standard Research Classification, for the longest time, Indigenous studies was completely invisible in this key part of basically infrastructure for the research, science and innovation system. That was recently amended. Indigenous studies is now recognised as its own broad division alongside biological sciences and economics, etc. And Indigenous data sovereignty is now recognised as a field within that refreshed classification, which is really important. I think I might just skip along now because I see that we're almost out of time, but I think, if there's one key point, I think I'll just reduce it to 2 slides. If there's one key point, I think, from Indigenous data sovereignty, and people might ask, well, what is it really about? In the university context, it's really about moving away from this sort of barcode mentality, where you kind of scan in the information and then scan it out, and sort of ditching the maze mentality about where to find Indigenous information and data, and actually providing meaningful infrastructure and mechanisms to put Indigenous data, and the way that I've defined it, putting Indigenous data in Indigenous hands for Indigenous benefit. And that in a nutshell is really what Indigenous data sovereignty is about. And it's really about finding what are the pathways and the mechanisms that will enable that, and part of what Ngā Pau Te Māramatanga can do, in addition to the advocacies that we do at the sort of domestic and international level, is also supporting our researchers to be able to do that and to have those conversations for their communities. I was going to show some examples of Indigenous data sovereignty that are actually already in operation in Australia, because I knew that we had an Australian facilitator. I don't have time to go over those. I was also going to talk about, because there's a very much a spectrum of ways of operationalizing this, from sort of very soft mechanisms like principles to much more robust mechanisms. In the case of this research project that I was involved in, that was funded by a competitive contestable research fund. But what we really did is when we collected the data, we integrated the data, we built the data systems, we made sure transparently upfront in the beginning that none of it belonged to the University of Waikato, that we would build a digital archive that has all the data in it, guided by the culturally based ethical principles and values of the community, and that it will be controlled by them. So it's not mine as a researcher, it's not the University of Waikato's, it belongs to Ngāti Tepa, who is a sub-tribe, the Hapu, from whom I descend and worked alongside. And it was very important we were transparent up front. The project never would have got off the ground had we not had this in place, because it was about basically building a digital database of all of their ancestors, or trying to identify all of their ancestors that were born pre-1900 back to their common ancestor. That's an incredibly sensitive and important database to create, and it does not belong in the university system. So this is like a more sort of ambitious operationalization of Indigenous data sovereignty, but there's lots of different sorts of mechanisms that can be enacted if universities want to do it. And part of that is actually stepping up and saying, let's develop a strategy, and then working alongside Indigenous researchers within institutions and their relationships with communities to drive out and lead that strategy. Because, and I'll go to the end, because if we want to take that fundamental premise that Indigenous data belong in Indigenous hands, then any initiative or strategy has to be, by definition, Indigenous-led. And I think I did a bit of a whiz through, but I'll leave it at that. Should I, Waimarie?
Sure, I think that some of your final commentaries about data sovereignty within universities relates to a comment that Adrian has actually got in the chat. And I know that in terms of medical collections, there's challenges in that particular space, but I think that in some respects, with our repatriation of tipuna, koiwi, from different overseas collections, we're making inroads, but you might want to comment.
Oh no, absolutely. That's a huge area, and some of these issues are already being worked through, for example, in Genomics Aotearoa, which is one of the strategic investment platforms funded by MBIE. One of the, what I didn't get time to talk about, Adrian, was a major research project program actually that's based here at the University of Waikato called Tikanga and Technology, and it's really about a Māori values infused and based approach for thinking about all the issues that I've talked about. Part of it, some of the case studies that we're actually looking at when we're applying our frameworks to them involve the use of biometric data, used in, for example, facial recognition data used in police surveillance. Also, one of our case studies that we're looking at the moment is involving a plasma bank from a major longitudinal study that over a very long period of time has been taking samples from Indigenous communities. And so, you know, what to do with that? It's already been done. How do you put in place a robust mechanism? So, you know, a lot of these conversations are also around historical data that's been historically collected, not just in the present. And of course, the future uses and the secondary uses and the future reuse of data are hugely important. And when it comes to the biological sort of specimens, of course, they get very sensitive. So this is all within the ambit of Indigenous data sovereignty.
So I'm just casting my eyes around the screen in terms of hands up. We haven't got any hands up, but I think just given in the interest of time, it may well be appropriate at this point to pass back to Adrian, either for final comments or to housekeeping or whatever you do at the end of your sessions.
Yeah, I'm happy to take further questions if there are any. I've just been pouring my thoughts into the chat. You know, if there are any questions that people want to add. So there's a comment from Wellen. Wellen, do you want to just follow up on any of that with regard to University Malaya? Or maybe not. Hi, Wellen.
Yeah, hi, just some, thank you very much for this very, very excellent presentation, because at our university, we do not even have a Center for Indigenous Studies. I was the last head last year, and I am no longer the head of the Center for Malaysian Indigenous Studies, but we are bringing another research group to our faculty, and we are starting from scratch, basically. So what you have presented today is very enlightening, and there's so much to learn about how to build this kind of knowledge, you know, and this kind of structure. So I just want to ask a little question. Do you have any kind of workshop or course that you might want to offer to people like us who are not having any knowledge in terms of trying to put things together like what you have done for your center? I mean, it would very, very useful, you know, because we do not have this kind of knowledge. If I would like to put things together, for example, I will start from zero. And our research on indigenous knowledge are scattered everywhere. And I'm very, very impressed to see how you structure the faculties, not based on faculties, but based on the knowledge, Maori knowledge. And for us, indigenous people are just at the periphery of all of this knowledge at the university. And even courses that we would like to introduce to the students, for example, students can only take these courses from our Department of Anthropology. And I'm teaching 3 of those 5, and it's very limited. So there's so much to learn from our side. And I would really hope that you have some kind of workshops or courses that we can attend, you know, like to have some kind of collaborations to teach us how to do this.
Thanks. Thanks for your comment and for your question. No, we don't have specific courses, but although I think what I want to say is that, you know, around the globe, Indigenous peoples within the Academy are engaged in this project from within their own contexts, dealing with their own challenges. Some of those challenges we share, and you know, it makes sense to actually share what our experiences have been with each other in collegial fashion. And then some of those challenges are unique and specific to circumstance. I'd really encourage you to come down to get online to our International Indigenous Research Conference. Tahu just flicked me a note and said, that might actually be a great topic for a masterclass. So you've certainly seeded the idea, and we're going to go and think about it, I think. So, tēnā koe, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I certainly will.
And it's absolutely the rationale for the APRU Indigenous Knowledges Network is that there's just so much to be gained from sharing expertise and knowledge, but also the ways in which different universities support or don't support the kind of efforts to recognize Indigenous knowledge in the Academy, as I said earlier. So that's kind of why we're here, and it's been so good to hear everything you're doing. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, well, on that note then, I'd like to thank Linda and Mohi and Tahu for a wonderful discussion, and to all of you for participating in the seminar today. And I think we'd all agree that it's been fascinating and really highly informative. I'd just like to finish off by thanking my APRU colleagues in the Secretariat in Hong Kong and at University Malaya, so Welland's here, the University of California, Davis, and Tec de Monterrey for their work and support in running this seminar series. And on that note, let me remind you all that the third seminar in the series will be on reclaiming indigeneity and will be held at the same time on Friday, the 27th of May on this side of the Pacific, and Thursday, the 26th of May for those of you on the other side. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening, as the case may be. So thank you very much. And I'll leave it there. Jackie, do you need to say anything, or have I covered it all off?
You have. You've done a great job. Thank you, everyone, for your presentation. Very valuable to everyone. Thank you.
We'll
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.